welcome to the first Bio 104 lab. I hope to do these short little videos as a way to help guide you and give you some tips and tricks for completing the lab, especially with these first ones where you may not be as familiar with these supplies or have an idea on how to set things up. Having done lots of labs, I have a little bit of experience that hopefully will help you. So what I've done is I've set up a workspace where I can do the labs. I'm unable to do these labs in my kitchen because my kitchen is too small. And so I picked a table, and because I know that I can be a little klutzy, because I know that things get spilled and we're dealing with supplies that are staining, I bought one of these kind of cheapy coverings to protect my workspace. I know it looks a little fancy, but really this was pretty cheap. I'm not going to feel real bad if this gets spilled on or it gets stained. So I laid this out over my workspace, and of course I kicked out all of my cats and children and curious adults so that I could be uninterrupted, especially since during these experiments we will have some fire going, we'll have some hot boiling liquid. I don't want anyone to get hurt. I then went through the list of supplies. So over here on this side I have all of the supplies which came from my hands-on lab kit that I'm going to need for this first experiment. We've got our burner and our stand, our glassware, of course our safety equipment, the goggles and the gloves. And then I went ahead and got my scale set up and ready to go. Now one of the things I noticed is in the lab video, they give a short little video on how to use the scale before getting into the experiments. Our scale, or at least the scale that came with my kit, is not the same scale that's being shown in that video. So with this scale, make sure, or your scale, whichever model it is, make sure to pop the batteries in. And then this is actually a cover that comes off. When I pull that cover off and hit the power button, I get that happy little green light that tells me that my scale is ready to go. As with all equipment, please make sure to read through the owner's manual that comes along with your scale. It's fairly short and it will tell you the other details that you need in order to operate this scale. Whenever it's not in use, make sure to put that protective cover on and make sure that it's turned off by holding that button for 3 seconds. Now the other thing that I noticed is a little bit different is we're going to be using a cute little weigh boat whenever we're measuring substances. In the video, they require you or ask you to use a plain sheet of white paper, and that would work. But this little weigh boat is way cuter, and it's got these beveled edges that will help keep everything in a little bit easier. You may even want to use this weigh boat in the third experiment that we're doing today, when it's asking you to weigh out some sugar for that experiment. Over here, on this side of the table, I've laid out all of the supplies that I needed to bring as a student. So one of those supplies is distilled water. Make sure that you get distilled water as opposed to spring water. Distilled water has everything removed. It's just pure water. Now even spring water and some of the other things that you can buy at the store, they're going to have some minerals and some impurities in there. Whenever we use distilled water, there's a reason for it. We need pure water. So make sure to pick up some distilled water. The other thing to keep your eye on is when you're picking up the isopropyl alcohol. I noticed at the store there were several different concentrations. For this first experiment, we want a really high concentration of alcohol. So make sure it's at least 95% or higher. I was able to find this 99% isopropyl alcohol. I've got all the rest of my supplies ready to go here. And the one supply that I was a little perplexed about until I read a bit further was picking up the pie tins. Of course, it made me think of dessert as opposed to a wonderful little safety device. What we're going to be doing with this pie tin is we're going to be placing our stand and our burner inside of it. So whenever we're using this heat source, we have an extra layer protecting our work surface, and we have a container in case anything were to spill or to have any problems. So this pie tin is going to be really helpful whenever we're using our burner supplies. So make sure to get all your supplies set up. Make sure you've identified everything that you need before you start in on the experiments. And then once you have your experiments, you should have everything right at your fingertips, ready to go. So for the first experiment, you will be measuring the length of different things. And when you're using your ruler, keep in mind one side has inches and the other side has centimeters. And what we need to do is convert that to millimeters or whatever the questions are asking us to do with the conversions. So on this metric side, make sure that you're using that when it's called for in the measurements. Now maybe you noticed on the Eagle course site, before you clicked on the heading that allowed you into the hands-on lab software to start working through your experiments, maybe you noticed that I had some tips what you were going to be achieving. And there was a little ruler there, and that ruler is going to help you for your metric to metric conversions. So I'll always have at the top of the heading before you enter into the lab on the Eagle course site, I'll always have some tips to help you out. And I know that metric to metric conversions for a lot of us is a little bit intimidating. And hopefully that ruler will help you to make those conversions. So for the first part, you're going to be measuring in length and doing those metric to metric conversions and whatever conversions are required by the lab questions. For the second part of that first lab, what you will be doing is you will be taking some temperature measurements. And in order to take those temperature measurements, the first thing that's required of you is to measure 75 milliliters of hot tap water. Now, for a lot of us, we don't know how warm our tap water is. We haven't checked our hot water heater or even necessarily know where it's at to know what that temperature setting is. And even if we do know, the temperature by the time it reaches our faucet may have changed. So you're going to get your beaker and you're going to let your hot water run. In the lab protocols, they say 15 seconds. But if you live on the second or the third floor, or if your faucet is really far away from your hot water heater, you're going to need to let it run a lot longer. So test the water. We want to make sure that that water is as hot as it's possibly supposed to be, but be very careful. Don't hurt yourself when you're testing that water from your tap. Some of our hot water heaters are set pretty high. So once you have your water measured, the way how we're going to measure it out is we're going to start at the bottom, and then we're going to measure up until we reach almost the 80. We want to get that 75 milliliters. So start at the bottom and measure up. The other big thing that I need to point out is a lot of times we're going to stick that right underneath the tap. And in order to get an accurate 75 milliliter measurement, we need to make sure to set it on a flat surface and then lean down and check in to see if we have that 75 milliliters. If we have it tilted one way or another, we may not get an accurate measurement. So get in the habit of measuring your liquid, setting it on a solid flat surface, and then checking to see if you have the appropriate amount. Once you have the appropriate amount, put your thermometer in. And one of the things we need to make sure is that we give this thermometer a little bit of time to work. It's going to take some time for that red line to shoot up and give us a measurement on how hot our water is, but we don't want to wait too long. If we wait too long, our water is going to start to lose heat to the environment and our measurement won't be as accurate. So part of what we're doing with this is learning that just right moment in time when we can capture the temperature without losing too much heat to the environment. So measure your hot tap water. Another thing that you're going to be doing in this experiment is measuring the temperature of water when it's boiling. In order to do that, we are going to be using our burner system. So we remove the thermometer from our beaker of water. And what I noticed is my stand is really tight to my fuel. So what I'm doing is I'm setting it up in the pie pan. This means that once everything is set up, I'm not going to knock it over by trying to slide the burner in after it's been lit. I know that the protocols ask for you to do that. Maybe your burner is small enough and it won't bump or jostle this, but mine is a super tight fit. So I want everything set up, including my beaker on top. before I go in and light my burner. This way, once my flame is started, I'm not going to be touching it or bumping it or having any possibility of knocking this thing over. Now, when you go to light this, I touch the lighter to the little white fluffy thing. That's our wick that's connected to the oil inside. And I recognize that this light surface is really hard for you to see that little flame. Once we have our flame going, as you can see, it's blue and just a little bit orange on top. It can often be really challenging to see the flame on these little burn units. So my burner is going, and I know the cliche, a watched pot never boils. So I'm not going to watch this directly, but I am going to keep my eye on it. I'm going to glance at it every so often, out of the corner of my eye. I don't want to know it's being watched, because I want it to boil really quickly. We don't want this experiment to take all day. Once my water has come to a boil, I'm going to follow the protocols in the hands-on lab site. When I'm finished with my experiment, I'm going to take this handy little yellow cup, and this foil cup is just going to pop over the top. This means I can extinguish the flame safely and without having to touch anything or blow on it or potentially spread anything anywhere. I can keep my face and my body far away from the burning unit. So make sure that you're following all of the protocols, going step by step. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things as you're working through your experiments that may be helpful for you today. I'm going to slide this out of the way. And because I didn't get my water up to boiling, I know it's not hot. So I'm going to set it here to the side. And I want to point out, with the different measuring units that we're using today, I wanted to point out something that maybe you wouldn't necessarily catch as you're trying to keep up with all of the experiments and really figure out how this is all going to work. When we're using these different measuring devices, they have different purposes. And one thing that we'll notice, or we're supposed to notice, is that there's different levels of accuracy with each of these different measuring units. So if I start here with my pipette, if you notice in the pipette and you look closely, you can see lots and lots of increments. This pipette can only hold up to 2 milliliters of liquid, whereas this beaker can hold 100. What that means is that I can get really refined measurements. I can get down to the tenths, even the hundredths place in my measurement. I can get very, very precise when I am using this pipette. When I'm using this beaker, even measuring 75 milliliters was hard because there isn't a tick mark for it. There isn't an increment. I had to kind of guess where 75 was in between 60 and 80. So this is not going to be as accurate. We're going to use this when we don't need that really tight precision. But what about something like our graduated cylinder? Well, it's in between. When you were using this to measure the distilled water and the alcohol, you might have noticed that, there's some accuracy here, but it's still not great. You still have to make some guesses. So when it comes to our different measuring devices, our beakers are least accurate and our pipette is our most accurate. The other thing that you may not have noticed when you were using these devices is what water can do. Water can form this thing called a meniscus because of the surface tension. It can either do this bubble up and become convex, or it can bubble down and become kind of a depression and become concave. What this means is that if it bubbles up, I may think that I have measured 80 milliliters here in my beaker, but when it bubbles up, I may have 85, 87 milliliters. If it bubbles down and that meniscus is formed in this kind of concave form, I may have only gotten 77, 74 milliliters. It is surprising how inaccurate that meniscus can make our measurements. And yet when I looked at it, I swore it was exactly 80. But depending on how that meniscus formed, it may make my measurements a lot less accurate. So we have a great big surface area like we do with our beaker. We're going to have a bigger meniscus, higher possibility of having an inaccurate measurement. The graduated cylinder is a little bit more narrow, but it will still have a meniscus. But these pipettes, holy cow, very, very, very small meniscus. So a second reason, not only do we have more refined increments between each major measurement, but then we also have less chance of having a meniscus affect our measurement. So hopefully this helps you to understand a little bit more as to why we use different tools for different experiments. Sometimes we need really refined measurements, and sometimes it's okay if there's some error. So with this first lab, we're doing a lot. The first thing, of course, is just getting familiar with how to use all these different tools, pouring things, starting to get confident in our ability to conduct these experiments. Another big thing that's happening during this first lab is we're figuring out how to move in the space. Where do we want to place things? How does it feel most efficient? How does it feel the best? How does it feel like we're not going to knock things over? Where can I place things so that I have less of a risk of causing damage or destruction and more of a chance of doing things successfully? Now, as you move through your experiments, please feel free to email me. And in that email, you may want to attach a photo or maybe a short video. Maybe you did something and you're not sure why it didn't work out. You can attach those photos and videos. You'd be surprised what I can diagnose with photos and videos. And of course, we have the Zoom meetings, those Zoom office hours from 11 to noon every Wednesday. You can just jump in, follow that Zoom link on Eagle. If you have any questions, email me. Come into the Zoom meetings. I want to be able to help. My last thing today is how you take off your gloves. When you are dealing with gloves, the important thing is to try and keep all of the gunky stuff that you've been touching inside of your gloves. In order to do that, we hook our thumb underneath one glove, pull it straight off of our fingertips, and then with the other side, we hook and then encapsulate that first glove into our second glove, throw it into the garbage, and keep all of our gunky stuff that we don't want to contaminate our area together. I hope you enjoyed this first lab, and as they get more complicated, you feel confident in tackling those experiments.